In a jaw-dropping live TV moment, Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood takes on a liberal TV host in the most savage way possible when the host tries to challenge Eastwood. The cameras rolled, and the studio lights burned hot, bleaching the set in a clinical glow. The audience, a curated mix of political junkies, Hollywood insiders, and a few planted hecklers, shifted in their seats, sensing the undercurrent of something about to snap. The air smelled of stage makeup, artificial cooling systems, and the faint chemical sharpness of fresh coffee in the green room. At the center of it all sat Clint Eastwood, calm as a mountain before a storm. His weathered hands rested lightly on the armrests of his chair, fingers barely curling, as if they could tighten into fists at any moment. His presence alone was enough to command the room. The man was more than just a Hollywood icon. He was a monument, something carved out of time itself. Across from him, leaning in just a little too eagerly, was the host, Damon Reeves, a man built for television. Not for wisdom, not for experience, but for the quick cut, the viral clip, the 5-second soundbite that would make his side of the internet howl in victory. He thrived on moments where his guests squirmed, where his interruptions caught them off guard, where he could mold the narrative like wet clay in his perfectly moisturized hands. You see, Reeves wasn't just here to interview Clint Eastwood. He was here to corner him, to make him slip, to turn him into a relic of a bygone era. Because if he could do that, if he could dismantle a legend on live television, then for one night, he would be the biggest name in the room. The applause sign flashed. The audience complied. Reeves smiled the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest tonight. A man whose career spans decades, whose name is practically synonymous with the Western hero. But lately, he's been making headlines for reasons other than film. He turned to Clint, the stage lights reflecting off his two white teeth. "Mr. Eastwood, let's talk about that." Silence. Clint didn't move, didn't flinch, but something shifted in the air, something electric, because he knew, everyone knew, that the first shot had just been fired. For a moment, Clint didn't answer. He just sat there, still as stone, his fingers tracing slow, idle circles on the armrest. The silence stretched, swallowing the forced energy of the applause that had just died down. You see, most guests rushed to fill that kind of silence, afraid of dead air, afraid of the weight of an unspoken challenge. But Clint let the moment breathe. The audience shifted, the seats creaking beneath them. A bead of sweat traced an uncertain path down the temple of one of the camera operators. The air conditioning hummed, but it did little to cool the room. Reeves, still smiling, though now with just the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, leaned forward, elbows on the desk, the predatory gleam of a man who smelled blood. He had waited for this, planned for it, rehearsed it in his dressing room mirror. Because this was how it worked. Establish control early, keep the subject reacting, never let them settle. "You've always been known as Hollywood's tough guy," Reeves began, voice smooth, perfectly measured. A man's man. A symbol of the old school, hard-nosed, no-nonsense American ideal. But the world has changed, Clint. He let the words settle, like a baited hook lowering into deep water. "Some people say your brand of masculinity doesn't belong anymore. That it's outdated, even dangerous." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not loud, but noticeable. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't shock. It was expectation. Because Reeves wasn't just asking a question. He was setting the stage, tightening the noose, waiting for the moment Eastwood would step into it. "But let's be honest," Reeves continued, one hand making a lazy, dismissive motion through the air. "The way things are going, Hollywood doesn't really need guys like you anymore, does it?" The way he said it, so casually, so effortlessly brutal, wasn't just a challenge. It was a sentence, a declaration that Clint Eastwood, the icon, the legend, was an artifact, a relic, a fossil sitting beneath a museum plaque that read, "Once relevant, no longer needed." And that's when it happened. Clint moved. Not much, just a shift of his shoulders, the slow tilt of his head, the creak of old leather as he adjusted his position. But you see, it wasn't the movement itself, it was what it meant. Reeves had no idea. The audience had no idea. But Clint Eastwood was about to answer. A quiet settled over the room. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else, something heavier. The kind of quiet you get just before a storm when the wind dies and the air thickens, like the world itself is holding its breath. And Clint let it hang there. Because you see, Reeves had made a mistake. Not in his words, no, the words were calculated, honed like the edge of a knife. But in his assumption, he thought Clint Eastwood was just another guest, just another old actor who would fumble, who would get flustered, who would lean back in his chair and laugh nervously and try to explain himself. But Clint wasn't that kind of man. Instead, he exhaled, slow, deliberate, the breath like gravel rolling down a canyon wall. His fingers, which had been tracing lazy circles on the chair's armrest, stilled. He raised his head, steel blue eyes locking onto Reeves, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out low, measured, carrying the weight of decades. Son. Just that. One word. And yet, it was enough to make Reeves blink. Something about the way Clint said it, unrushed, unshaken, shifted the energy in the room. The host's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but Clint caught it. Everyone did. You keep talking about what the world needs, Clint continued, slow and steady, like a gunslinger unbuckling his holster. That's funny. He leaned forward now, just a little, just enough. Because last I checked, the world's in worse shape than it's ever been. A murmur rolled through the audience, a shifting of weight, the fabric of seats creaking beneath them. Reeves straightened, attempting to regain control. Well, that's... Clint cut through him like a knife through wet paper. You ever build a fence, Damon? The question came out of nowhere, hitting sideways, unexpected. Reeves blinked. What? Clint ignored him, eyes still locked in, voice slow as a rattlesnake winding through the dust. A fence. You ever dig a hole in the ground, mix the cement, set the post, run the wire, stretch it tight? Ever bust your knuckles on a hammer swing that missed its mark? Ever wake up before dawn, before the sun even thought about showing up, and feel the cold bite into your fingers while you worked? Reeves shifted uncomfortably, but Clint didn't stop. Didn't think so, he said, almost to himself. See, the thing about a fence is, you don't think you need one until it's too late. Until the wolves come. Until something slips through that don't belong. His gaze didn't waver. That's the problem with your kind, Damon. You think because the world's different, the wolves disappeared. But they didn't. You just stopped paying attention. A pin could have dropped and shattered the floor. Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it. The studio lights, which had been set at the perfect warmth to flatter a man's face, suddenly felt hotter than they should have. The air, once crisp and filtered, now felt thick. And Clint? Clint just sat back, easy, like a man who'd seen this play out before. Because he had. And he knew, that Reeves was already scrambling, searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. Reeves swallowed. It was subtle, but not subtle enough. His carefully manicured demeanor, the smooth-talking, always in control persona he had perfected over years in television, had cracked just slightly. And Clint saw it. Everyone did. But you see, Reeves wasn't the type to go down without a fight. He was a professional, trained to spin, to redirect, to regain control of a conversation before it slipped through his fingers like sand. And right now, that's exactly what he was trying to do. Act like he was still in control. A forced chuckle escaped him, light and dismissive, the kind used when someone wants to pretend they aren't rattled. Well, Clint, he said, shifting in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk as if he were casually weighing his next words. That's quite the metaphor. Very poetic. But let's be honest, he leaned in slightly, attempting to reassert himself. You're talking about a world that doesn't exist anymore. People don't need fences like they used to. We're more connected than ever. Borders are outdated and frankly, this whole idea of old-school toughness, he air-quoted it with a smug little smirk, isn't just unnecessary. It's toxic. That was it. His pivot. His Hail Mary. He wanted the audience to nod along, to hear that word, toxic, and instinctively side with him. Because that's how it worked, right? Attach the right buzzword, frame the right narrative, and suddenly, he was back in charge. But Reeves had made a mistake. A fatal one. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't like the others. He didn't play by the same rules. The old gunslinger tilted his head just slightly, the kind of movement a man makes when he's weighing whether something is worth his time. His fingers drummed the armrest once, twice. And then, without breaking eye contact, he exhaled a small, tired chuckle. Not the nervous kind. Not the kind that fills dead air, but the kind that carries the weight of 1,000 battles won before this one even started. You know, Clint mused, voice steady, calm, dangerous. I once had a rattlesnake on my porch. Reeves blinked, his lips parted slightly, his brain scrambling to decipher where the hell this was going. I'm sorry, what? Clint ignored him. Was a nasty thing, thick as my wrist, laid out in the sun, soaking up the heat, minding its own business. He paused, just long enough. And I could have let it be. Could have looked at it and said, well, times have changed. Snakes got just as much a right to the porch as I do. The audience was silent now, leaning in, waiting. But here's the thing, Damon, Clint continued, his voice lowering just a fraction. It wasn't my porch the snake cared about. His fingers curled slightly on the armrest. It was the house. The door. What was inside? Reeves shifted again. So I had two choices, Clint said, voice even. I could let it sit there. Pretend like it didn't matter. Hope it just slithered away on its own. He let the silence stretch. Let the weight of the words settle deep into the bones of every person in that room. Or I could grab a shovel. He leaned back. Let that last sentence hang there. Breathe. Settle deep into Reeves' chest. The host swallowed again. This time not subtly at all. His fingers fidgeted against the desk. His jaw tensed. Because what the hell was he supposed to say to that? For the first time all night, Reeves had no comeback. The studio was dead silent now. No forced laughter. No murmurs. Just tension thick enough to carve with a knife. You see, when a man like Clint Eastwood spoke, when he really spoke, people didn't just hear it. They felt it. And right now, Reeves was feeling it more than anyone. But he couldn't just sit there, could he? No, that wasn't how this worked. The show was his. The audience was his. The narrative, it was supposed to be his. So he forced himself to sit up straighter, shoulders squared, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. He had been embarrassed, sure, but this wasn't over. He could still recover. He just had to reframe things, spin it back in his favor. A quick inhale, a controlled exhale. He plastered on that smug TV host smirk, the one designed to make it look like he was still the smartest man in the room, and forced a small chuckle. So what, Clint? He said, voice almost casual. Are you saying the world's problems can be solved by, what? Beating things with a shovel? A few people in the audience chuckled, nervous, uncertain, but it was something. It was enough. Reeves felt the thread of control slip back into his hands, just a little. He pressed forward. I mean, come on, he said, shaking his head. That's the problem with guys like you. You think every issue can be handled with brute force. But the world's more complicated than that now. He spread his hands, inviting the audience back onto his side. We've evolved. We've progressed. You can't just fight your way through every challenge, Clint. And there it was, his way out. If he could paint Clint as outdated, as barbaric, then he could still win this. The people watching at home would forget how they felt a moment ago, and they'd latch onto the idea that Eastwood was just an old man clinging to a world that didn't exist anymore. But Clint didn't flinch, didn't blink. He just smiled. And that was worse. Because it wasn't a friendly smile, wasn't an amused smile. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he knows something you don't. The kind that makes your stomach tighten, even if you don't know why yet. Then, slowly, deliberately, Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing himself just a little closer. Reeves didn't lean back. He wanted to, instinctually, but he knew he couldn't. Not without looking weak. So he stayed still, even as his fingers curled slightly on the desk. And then Clint spoke. You ever hear of the Donner Party, Damon? Reeves blinked. What? The Donner Party, Clint repeated, voice calm. A group of pioneers, back in the 1800s, headed west. Got trapped in the Sierra Nevadas when the winter came early. Reeves hesitated, unsure where this was going. Okay. They were stuck, Clint continued, unbothered. No food, no way out. And at first, they tried to hold on to civilization. Tried to do things the right way. He tilted his head slightly. You know what happened next? Reeves didn't answer. Clint did. They ate each other. Silence. Reeves blinked rapidly, as if trying to process the shift. That's... You see, Clint went on, voice slow, deliberate. People like to talk about progress. About how we're more advanced now, more evolved. He exhaled softly. But when the world stops working the way it's supposed to, when the comforts are gone, when the rules don't matter anymore, people always go back to who they really are. A chill ran through the audience. Some of them probably didn't even know why. That's the funny thing about civilization, Clint said, his voice quiet, but carrying. It's only there for as long as it's convenient. When it stops being convenient, he leaned back again, letting his words settle. The wolves come back. Reeves swallowed hard. And just like that, the fight was over. The silence that followed wasn't just empty. It was heavy, like the moment before a dam breaks, like the kind of quiet you hear in an old house just before the floorboards groan under unseen weight. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were hanging on to every word, every breath, every shift in the air. And Reeves? Reeves was drowning in it. His fingers twitched, barely noticeable, against the sleek surface of his desk. His jaw clenched, then unclenched, then clenched again. His mind was scrambling, searching for a way to fix this, to pull back control, to say something, anything that would put him back in the driver's seat. But there was nothing, because Clint had taken the wheel and driven the conversation off a cliff, and Reeves was still trying to figure out where the road went. He forced another laugh, one of those weak, awkward chuckles that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, Clint, he said, clearing his throat, that's certainly a dramatic way to put it. Clint didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't smile. He just watched. And that was worse. Reeves swallowed, shifting in his chair again. He needed to move on, needed to wrap this up before he lost any more ground. He turned to the audience, forcing a grin. Well, folks, you've heard it here. Clint Eastwood, legendary actor, director, and apparently, part-time doomsday philosopher. A few people chuckled, not because they thought it was funny, but because they didn't know what else to do. Clint still didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Reeves turned back to him, desperate to regain some kind of control. So what are you saying, Clint? He asked, forcing the conversation forward, as if pretending he wasn't rattled would make it true. That we should all just go back to the old ways? That we should live like we're in the Wild West again? He smirked, thinking he'd finally found a way to make Clint sound ridiculous. Should we all carry 6 shooters and settle things in the street? And that's when Clint moved. It was small, subtle, a slow, measured shift forward. His hands, which had been resting on the armrests, came together, fingers lacing. His eyes, those cold, sharp, storm-gray eyes, locked onto Reeves like a hawk watching a field mouse. Then, finally, he spoke. No. That single word landed like a gunshot in the room. Clint leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to something low and steady. I'm saying that people like you don't know what you're playing with. Reeves opened his mouth, but Clint kept going. You sit up here in your suit, under these lights, in front of your cameras, and you think you understand how the world works. His tone was even. Not angry, not heated, just certain. You talk about progress like it's something that just happens. Like civilization is some kind of machine that runs on its own, that don't need anyone to tend to it. He paused, just long enough. But the only reason you get to sit here, Clint continued, voice never rising, never wavering. The only reason you get to laugh and call men like me relics, he exhaled, shaking his head slightly, is because tougher men than you built the fence that keeps the wolves out. Reeves blinked. The smugness drained from his face so fast it was almost visible. And Clint? Clint sat back again, slow, casual, as if he hadn't just cracked the foundation beneath the man sitting across from him. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't shifting in their seats. weren't glancing at their phones or fidgeting in their spots. They were listening. Because this wasn't a debate anymore. This wasn't a talk show anymore. This was a reckoning. And Reeves knew it. That's why he forced a grin, one last attempt to save face. "Well, Clint," he said, clearing his throat, "that's quite the monologue." He chuckled, waving a hand as if to brush the moment away. "Maybe I should hire you as a screenwriter." He turned to the audience, waiting for them to laugh, to move on. But no one did. Because this time, they weren't on his side. They were on Clint's. And Reeves had never felt so small. You see, there are moments in life that don't just happen. They echo. They stretch past the instant they occur, leaving behind something heavier, something that lingers long after the dust has settled. And this was one of those moments. Because right now, Reeves wasn't just losing control of the interview. He was losing control of the entire room. It was in the silence. The kind that wasn't just empty but charged, like the thick air before a thunderstorm. It was in the way the audience was watching Clint now. Not like he was some old Hollywood legend, but like he was something more. Reeves could feel it. And that was a problem. Because you see, men like him lived on control. It wasn't just a tool. It was the very foundation that let them stand taller, talk louder, push narratives like they were universal truths. And right now, that foundation was cracking beneath his feet. So he did what cornered men always do. He tried to fight back. He leaned in, a small smirk curling at his lips, but there was a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "Well, Clint," he said, keeping his tone light, "I gotta say, you're quite the philosopher tonight. Maybe we should call you the cowboy Socrates." He chuckled, just a little, waiting for the audience to follow. They didn't. Clint didn't even blink. That smirk on Reeves' face? It twitched, just slightly, before he masked it, covering it up with an exaggerated shrug. "But come on," he continued, pressing forward, trying to reclaim lost ground. "Let's be real here. The world you're talking about? It's gone. People don't need to fight for survival anymore. We've moved past that." And then, with just a hint of that old smugness creeping back in, he said, "Maybe you just miss a time when people didn't have to think so much." There. That should do it. That was his lifeline, his escape. He'd framed Clint as the past, outdated, irrelevant, a relic who didn't understand the real world anymore. Except Clint didn't take the bait. Instead, he did something worse. He smiled. Not the Hollywood smile, not the forced grin of a man trying to play nice. No, this was something deeper, something quieter. The kind of smile a man gives when he's already won, and he knows it. Then, in a voice so calm it was unshakable, Clint said, "You ever been in a fight, Damon?" Reeves blinked. What?" Clint tilted his head slightly. "A real fight." The question hung there, and suddenly, the air in the studio felt different. Reeves opened his mouth, probably to deflect, to spin it into a joke. But Clint kept going. "I don't mean an argument," he said. "I don't mean some debate where you sit in a chair and talk over somebody until you think you've won." His fingers tapped against the armrest, slow and steady. "I mean a real fight, where you can feel your own blood in your mouth, where you've got seconds to decide if you're going to stay down or get back up." Reeves didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer, not one that mattered. Clint leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough that the audience had to lean in to hear it. "See, that's the thing about men like you," he murmured. "You talk real pretty about the way the world should be, but you've never had to test if any of it's true." Reeves swallowed. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but the cameras caught it, and so did the audience. Because this wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a man being unmade in real time. The moment stretched on like the longest second in history. The silence, thick and heavy, felt like it could suffocate you if you dared to breathe too deeply. Reeves, for all his bravado, sat there frozen, his face a twisted mix of disbelief and something darker, something that, even now, he couldn't quite put his finger on. But Clint? Clint wasn't looking for pity. Clint had already won. You see, when a man like Clint Eastwood speaks, you don't just hear the words. You feel them. They penetrate the air, carving out space, making everyone in the room reconsider everything they thought they knew. And Clint was doing that right now, shifting the ground beneath Reeves, making the entire world tilt just enough to make him question whether the floor was still solid beneath his feet. Clint's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, just enough to let the weight of the moment settle in. The audience? They were rapt, waiting for the inevitable. And Reeves, still clinging to whatever little bit of control he could, leaned forward in a last-ditch attempt to salvage his dignity. "Well, Clint, I gotta hand it to you," he said, his voice more strained now, an edge of desperation creeping in. "You sure know how to talk a good game. You're real convincing, I'll give you that." He forced a laugh, though it didn't quite sound natural. "But I think we both know, we're not in the Wild West anymore." Reeves chuckled again, but there was nothing behind it now. His fingers gripped the desk, knuckles white, eyes flickering to the side, avoiding Clint's stare as if trying to find a lifeline somewhere, anywhere. But there was no escape. Clint didn't smile. He didn't need to. His voice was calm, unwavering, like a thunderclap on the horizon, slow but inevitable. "You're right." He paused, letting the words hang in the air for a moment, the weight of them sinking deep into the space between them. "We're not in the Wild West anymore. But you want to know something?" Clint's voice dropped, just enough to make the audience lean in, straining to catch every syllable. "Sometimes, the Wild West is still in us." The words hit Reeves like a punch to the gut. He blinked rapidly, his throat tightening. There was no clever response, no comeback that would fix this. Clint had just redefined the entire conversation, turned it on its head with one simple truth that, despite everything Reeves had said, he couldn't deny. Clint straightened in his chair, the last nail in the coffin. His gaze never wavered from Reeves, cold and steady, like a man who knew exactly what was coming next. He didn't need to say more. The silence spoke louder than anything else ever could. And then, as if it were the most casual thing in the world, Clint leaned back and gave his final, effortless blow. "Sometimes, Damon, the problem with people like you," he paused, his voice lower now, just a whisper that cut through the thick tension in the room, "is that you think civilization will save you." The words fell like the weight of 1,000 years of history. They shattered whatever was left of Reeves' composure. His breath hitched, his eyes widened, his mind scrambling, trying to grasp something, anything, to hold on to. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His world was crumbling around him, and there was nothing left to cling to, because Clint Eastwood had already delivered the final truth. And it was too late. Reeves exhaled slowly, as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. He looked around the studio, eyes wild, but it was like looking into a mirror. He was seeing it now, really seeing it. His pride, his polished image, the narrative he had built for himself. It was all unraveling, thread by thread. And in that moment, he knew. He knew he would never get it back. Clint had done more than win the interview. He had broken him. The host tried to speak again, to laugh it off, to say something. But his voice cracked, and the audience noticed. That's when the air shifted again. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was a battle of wills, and Clint's had won. The camera zoomed in just slightly, capturing the fleeting moment, the one where the mask slipped completely off. Reeves was done. And Clint? Clint was finished, not with him, but with the whole charade. He leaned back again, his job done, watching as the host slowly crumbled before him. And for the first time in the night, Clint allowed a small, knowing smile. He didn't need to say another word. The message had been delivered. The show was over. If you enjoyed watching Clint Eastwood completely obliterate this TV host, don't forget to hit that like button. And for more epic moments, interviews, and jaw-dropping content like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me, it's going to be even bigger. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you think Clint should take on next? See you in the next video.